Before I begin, there was a brief presentation I made before. Was someone here in June to see a Scaled Agile presentation? A few. Okay, very good. So there's some new faces out there. I'm from the United States part of Intermedics. Obviously, we have a location here in CONUS, and I've been involved with Agile since 1998, rolling out in a variety of locations. And recently, over the last 5 years or so, I've been utilizing this concept called the Scaled Agile Framework. You can see this online at that very long name website, scaledagileframework.com. So I'd like to give you an overview of this. We'll also have a workshop where we're going to apply the techniques of exploring and using the estimation techniques around epics and features and stories. The Scaled Agile Framework, also called SAFE, is a free set of knowledge. You don't have to pay to go to a class if you don't want to. You can see it online at the safeframework.com. You can also read this from a variety of books, but it's freely available so that we can provide this knowledge to the community. There are some folks like myself who have received training so that we can provide formal training in classes. And my responsibility within Intermedics is to introduce this concept and then roll it out through the rest of the organization to implement it. I'd like to talk about SAFE at 4 levels. The overall framework, what does that represent? How is it applicable at a team level? How does it apply to a collection of teams, also called a program? And how might it apply to the entire enterprise, the organization at the portfolio level? This picture is a representation of SAFE, the Scaled Agile Framework, and it's meant to represent all the 4 levels, the 3 levels I should say, and we'll talk about a 4th level as I move forward. The author of the Scaled Agile Framework is Dean Leffingwell. He had written several books early in the 2000 era through 2008, and they became what were the foundation for the Scaled Agile Framework, these 2 books, but they're a little bit old, so you don't need to return back to that level. And there's a large community of participants helping to evolve the Scaled Agile Framework. Now, what I'm doing here is showing a large community of people who've had training and guidance and have attended various classes. They're referred to as SAFE Program Consultants or SAFE Program Consultant Trainers. If we look at this picture, the representation of SAFE, it has 4 levels shown, but it could be also made a little bit smaller to a medium-sized organization for 3 levels. So I'm going to focus first on those 3 levels. The team level, and notice that we have a picture including Scrum. We also have a picture including Kanban, so there may be 2 kinds of teams. One, a Kanban-driven Agile team. Another could be a Scrum-driven Agile team. In every one of the talks we've seen so far, we've talked about Agile for one team. The Scaled Agile Framework is trying to focus on how multiple teams work together. So those multiple teams will be collected together into a coordinated team of teams called an Agile release train. And then there's this overarching level, the portfolio level. So I'm going to talk about, from the top down, how the Scaled Agile Framework is organized. Again, the key word is Scaled Agile. If you would like to use Agile techniques in one team, that's absolutely fine and is part of the Scaled Agile Framework. But if you need to bring several teams, especially 3 or more teams together to build a large product or to be consistent across an entire organization, that's when Scaled Agile Framework is really relevant. And one of the things that the Scaled Agile Framework provides is a big picture understanding of the work that an organization is dealing with over a long period of time. So at a very, very lightweight oversight, we have a portfolio management community that will try to facilitate using Kanban techniques, the discovery and specification of large planning units that are called epics. And those epics would be funded by the enterprise. Now, the heart and soul of the Scaled Agile Framework is referred to as an Agile release train. Unfortunately, there's too many 3-letter acronyms in this, but an Agile release train, also called an ART, is a collection of teams that is a self-organizing, self-managing unit that drives the execution and delivery of value over time. And as you hear those words, you might begin to say, well, wait a minute, that sounds like an Agile team. Of course, all of the practices of a single Agile team would be applicable at the team of teams unit called the Scaled Agile Framework Agile Release Train. In order to facilitate the discovery, specification, and planning of larger projects, the planning unit of a team using stories is brought up to a larger unit called a feature. A feature is a larger unit of discovery and specification than one story, which is typically implemented in one sprint, 1 2-week period of time. An easy to remember thing is that a feature might be implemented in, let's say, 1 week or 1 month period of time by one team, as opposed to a story is often implemented by a team in 1 day to 1 week. So features are larger than stories, but those features are managed by and specified by the product management community. In order to facilitate the coordination of several teams, we want to make sure that they have a cadence which is synchronized. So the beginning of a sprint for team A, B, and C is always the same. And that's what these vertical lines are trying to represent, the start and stop of a sprint. The longer period of time that's involved for an Agile release train for planning is represented by these larger boundary units, and this period of time is just a planning horizon that is like a sprint, fixed in time, but predictably identified how long it will be and how many there will be. So typically the boundary here is somewhere between 3 sprints and 6 sprints. It doesn't change. Every time an Agile release train is created, we know ahead of time how long this period will be. And that period is, as I said, often 3 to 6 sprints, but it has a name. It's called the program increment. So think of a program increment as a longer period than a sprint, but we make a commitment, as we do in a sprint, to what are we trying to accomplish in that, say, 3-month period of time, and we have a boundary that allows us to start and stop that program increment in a coordinated fashion. At that bottom level, everything that is true about an Agile team still exists in the Scaled Agile framework. So you want self-directed, self-organizing teams, and we have product owners associated with those Agile teams. And if you're using the Scrum technique, we'll apply the concept of having a Scrum Master directly associated with that Agile team. We saw earlier that there was an opportunity to have Kanban as a process or a mechanism. So the typical infrastructure or customer support community that doesn't have the ability to predict what they're going to deliver on a sprint-by-sprint basis would use Kanban, and they would be coordinated in the same way as other Agile teams. So at the team level, we're delivering value by user stories, the traditional mechanism of every Agile approach. On the larger planning unit that we saw previously, we're going to utilize features that are collections of stories. As we move into SAFe at a larger environment, we may need an optional layer in between the portfolio and the program, and that optional layer is called the value stream, but we indicate that the same amount of planning duration is applied. So when we have higher level planning units, the description of the functionality is referred to as a capability. It's a collection of features. And so the picture that we want to represent Scaled Agile Framework with is this collection of a team of teams known as an Agile release train. And an Agile release train, as I indicated, is using all of the techniques of an Agile team, such as a product owner that is responsible for a backlog of work associated with an individual team. That concept of an individual product owner for one team is raised to a higher level by having either a product manager, one individual, or a collection of people as a community or a team called the product management team, and they're going to be doing planning of features, which would then be identified by the teams to be responsible for how they implement those features. So we're going to see in a moment that a product manager specifies features and a product owner is responsible for the stories. Some other roles and responsibilities that we see are identified here on the side. For every Agile release train, we want to provide the ability to have coordinated integration testing and integrated deployment and release processes. And so instead of having an Agile release train say to some release community, I'm now ready to deploy my software, this system team is coordinated with and is integrated with the Agile release train over time. We'll see later that the Agile release train will deliver value every 2 weeks and then can release at any time that they need to over multiple points through the course of the program increment. Some other labels that we have here are the lean Agile leaders. These are the traditional hierarchical managers of management of people. For example, the director of software development or the director of quality assurance. The role that they would be playing would be as a servant leader to facilitate and guide and enable those disciplines and those practices. But this community is self-organizing and self-managing, so there isn't a manager that owns an Agile release train, just as there isn't a manager that owns an Agile team itself. They would be guided by the backlog and the prioritization of the local product owner, and this larger community would be coordinated with the product manager. This picture is trying to represent the coordination of small, medium, and large planning units. Some tools, and even in some Agile practices, we have this word epic, which really in the tool represented large stories. So as a possible replacement to this word, you can think of it at the moment as a large initiative. An initiative would be identified in duration of, say, 3 to 9 months of time, and then that would be an organization of features that might be implemented in 1 to 2 months of time, and then that would be broken down into stories, which would be implemented, let's say, in 1 to 5 days of time. So stories are the traditional planning units of a team. Features would be the planning units of an Agile release train. On the right-hand side, we have a slightly different color to indicate that often we will need to enable some technology in order to build some functionality. So instead of having that just hidden on the side, not being known by the Agile release train, it's a first-class citizen in the planning unit associated with this Agile release train. So every backlog, whether it's at the team level, the program level, or the portfolio level, has architecture enablers and other kinds of technology needs that are appropriately prioritized and deployed by the Agile release train. From the top, we want to be guided by strategic executive directions setting that would identify investment themes to give general guidance on where the organization would like to go. So the investment themes are not directly implemented by the Agile release train, but they guide the creation of the epics and they guide the discovery of the features all the way down to the stories. So as we move all the way down through that hierarchical level, let's now focus back at the bottom of the team level and understand some of the skills that are relevant to an Agile release team. When I misspoke, not an Agile release team, I meant to say an Agile team. And that is, we've got this fixed boundary of time called an Agile sprint. And at the beginning of the sprint, we want to plan our work, execute our work with a daily Scrum activity, demonstrate our work, and have a retrospective. So everything that we've learned about an Agile team still exists in SAFe. The one thing that's different about SAFe is that it comes forward with the features that would guide the stories that that team needs to utilize. At the end of every 2-week sprint, traditional delivery of value of an Agile team would be working software that's fully tested, In addition to that, we want to take the results of many teams, 3 to 4 teams, and combine them together into a coordinated system demo. So every 2 weeks, we're going to have several teams bring their work together into a coordinated demo, eventually delivering value in the Agile release train. Questions? So anytime. In the middle of our sprint, we also want to introduce techniques such as a mid-sprint review, a specification workshop to drive and coordinate the discovery of the work of the teams. Now let's focus back on that middle tier, the program area. The Agile release train is a self-organizing, self-managing team of teams. It's not meant to be any sort of management overhead. It's really trying to facilitate a dynamic discovery by multiple teams working together. The only thing that we want to make sure that we do is have a common sprint lengths and common estimation. In order to facilitate that, we're going to have a face-to-face release and planning activity. We're going to see a picture of that momentarily. But realize that at the Scaled Agile framework, we have 2 levels of specification. At the team, the product owner lives with and is associated directly with an Agile team. We're going to be identifying sprint goals, writing stories, and acceptance criteria. They own the implementation of that Agile team, and they drive the sprint. The concepts of a product owner would then be raised to another level of the product manager. They're going to be often more customer-focused and outward bound, but they're going to drive the vision and overall coordination of the release of the Agile release train. So from the bottom looking up, every Agile team knows who their product owner is. There's one product owner associated with every Agile team. From every product owner, they may have a single individual known as the product manager, and that product owner would then be able to understand the direction that the product manager is heading. They also work with the architects associated with that Agile release train. So the focus here on SAFE is collection of teams called the Agile release train that's managed by and coordinated with product managers and product owners. So this left-hand side is really the business focus. The implementation of the Agile team delivers value every 2 weeks, and the Agile release train delivers value multiple times throughout the course of the program increment. Some of the challenges you might believe you would have with coordinated synchronized sprints would be, well, if I have 5 teams working over this long period of time called a program increment, am I only able to release once? The answer is no. You can release as many times as you need through the course of that program increment. So a period of time called a program increment is really the coordinated planning horizon. It's not meant to be, I can only release once. So you could release at the end of every sprint, you could release after several sprints, or you could release at the end of a program increment. Another key message of the Scaled Agile framework is we're trying to create a centralized discussion around strategy, but a decentralized execution against that strategy. You want to be able to make decisions locally at the team or at the program level instead of requiring that you go all the way to the portfolio. So the portfolio level is really trying to provide guidance and funding, but the execution of the program is where decisions are made locally. At the program level, we want to be guided by a common vision and a common roadmap that shows where that Agile release train is going over time. The vision is traditional kind of specification of goals and objectives, and the roadmap would be a prioritized collection of features over time. Then the highest level of the Scaled Agile framework is really just a lightweight guidance and oversight called the portfolio. That's where the centralized strategic decisions of the enterprise might be made, but the decentralized execution would be done at the Agile release train. And the representation of having multiple Agile release trains across one value stream, or possibly only one Agile release train against a value stream, is a matter of scale. The budget would be allocated per Agile release train, and each Agile release train owns that budget for the duration of that period of time, maybe a year. But the guidance of the portfolio would suggest that we need to make strategic directions, and that portfolio would guide each Agile release train as the direction the organization wants to go. So the Agile release train is the execution engine of the Scaled Agile framework. It's guided by the investment themes and driven by the budget of the enterprise, and they're helping to realize that portfolio. Those epics at the portfolio level drive the portfolio backlog. They drive the decision making about what budget to be allocated, but they're developed and analyzed through the course of a series of steps called the portfolio Kanban, where great ideas come into the portfolio and then they're translated into a more formal representation of the epic. Given the three levels of the Scaled Agile framework, portfolio, program, and team, we want to recognize there's local decision making of the product owner is prioritizing stories associated with that Agile team, but needs to be coordinated with the prioritization at the program level of the features, and we want to make sure that they're achieving the epics at the portfolio level. And another area of concern would be the alignment of something like architecture. As I move forward a bit, I'd like to focus on how architecture can be coordinated across those multiple levels. Architecture in Agile is a bit of a tricky consideration. If we talk about one small Agile team, what we typically expect is that that Agile team is organizing their technology and making choices locally. But if I have 5 teams trying to deliver one large piece of software, we may need to have more consistent directions and guidance. So on the side, we have a product management group that's coordinated by system architecture that would drive the decisions across this program. And so what we want to make sure that we do is enable a software architecture runway over time. Let's take a look at that. The Agile release train is guided by the decisions of the architecture, and those architecture specifications become part of the backlog of the Agile release train. So the system architects provide architecture guidance and also the facilitation of user experience designers, security, and data architects. And a question there.
The question is, what architecture in this context means? Is it a set of rules? Is it a set of technologies?
I think that's the appropriate question. So what is represented by architecture? It's the set of patterns, practices, and guidelines, and my inside joke, and several of the folks here have heard it before, that restrict needless creativity on the part of the developers of an individual Agile team. Now, what's needless creativity? If we have large components and layers of an architecture, you want to make those decisions ahead of time and give guidance to the Agile team, but within the context of the architecture, you can do appropriate creativity using design patterns and local technology choices. So is the essence of your question whether or not the architects are specifying the implementation of the architecture or the guidance of the architecture? I'm kind of following up with a question back to you. Did I address your concern? Yeah. Okay, thank you. It was a good question. At the highest level of the portfolio, if we have several Agile release trains, each of which have several Agile teams, we may need to have consistency across the entire enterprise. And that would be an enterprise architect at the most senior level. Similar to the flow of epics, features, and ultimately stories, we want to evolve the architecture through a series of activities of review, analysis, and then specification of the practices, patterns, and guidelines for that architecture. Now, in order to finally introduce the Scaled Agile framework to an organization, you want to make sure that you introduce training appropriately. This represents the concepts of having change agents or Agile consultants who are guided with a class that's called the SAFE Program Consultant class. And that SPC is then a person who could deliver training to the management and to the teams. Within Intermedics, we've been, this calendar year, introducing all development staff, whether here in CONUS or in the United States or other locations, by having two-day classes, one for executives, managers, team leads, and anyone interested in general Agile practices. They can attend the Leading Safe class. All members of all teams are then allowed to take the 2-day Safe for Teams class. They're consistent with and coordinated with each other. The SPC would be delivering those 2 different classes. Once we have everybody trained this year, we're hoping to then launch 1 or more Agile release trains. These are the classes that are available. As I mentioned, from the point of view of the SAFE classes are available to be taken, but you don't have to pay for them if you don't need to take the classes. You can get this information on the Scaled Agile Framework website directly. But a 4-day class for the SPCs, 2-day class for the managers, 2-day class for the team members, and over here on the side, if we wanted to, and we will be delivering in Intermedics, for the program managers and for, I misspoke, for the product managers and for the product owners. So here are different places you can go to get information about the Scaled Agile Framework. Clearly there is the entire website that we've seen pictures about at scaledagileframework.com, and there's various other sites. Roughly speaking, I'd say there's about 40,000 people across the world who've had SAFE training. You can then take classes directly or go on the website and get that information yourself. I'm going to flip back to the picture of the big picture, the entire Scaled Agile Framework as I go all the way back, and then I'll pause for any questions to see if we have any specific issues to address. And stop right here on a 3 level, Scaled Agile Framework at 3 levels. Are there any questions I can answer for you with regard to SAFE? Again, no problem.
The question is about this Agile release train. Is it requires that the planning of release should be discussed face-to-face?
I was just pausing to make sure that was the question. So yes, every practice that we apply at the team level is generally considered appropriate at the program level. So we strongly desire to have all members of all teams in one location to have face-to-face planning. Now let's talk about an Agile team. A 2-day, I misspoke, a 2-week sprint typically requires 2 hours of coordinated face-to-face planning at the team level. The same concept applies here, but it's a bit longer. If we're talking about 5 or 6 sprints, we would spend 2 days together. Now, the problem that's implied behind your question is, what if we have highly distributed multiple teams around the world? We want to have a virtual face-to-face meeting with satellite conversations, but we may have it slightly extended. Instead of 2 days, it could be 3 or 4 days long. But we want to do that together at the same time, identifying for the full period of time. So we absolutely want to use that practice, and it's a good question you're asking. Additional questions and concerns? Okay. Yes. Go ahead. Oh, I'm sorry, I pointed and the microphone went elsewhere. My fault.
So am I allowed to ask 2 questions?
Of course, yes.
Well, that was one, so now you're second.
A good one. So it seems like SAF actually adds quite a lot of overhead, so in terms of management, program management, and so on. So how much teams, scaled agile teams, is it worth having once you have the Scale Agile framework? And another question is, seems at the end of the sprint you have to do the system demo, right? So what happens if one team fails the story, which is dependent on another team, and you can actually do not have the demo, right?
Right, that's 2 slightly different questions, but all very appropriate and meaningful. Very important emphasis is that this is a collection of self-organizing, self-managing units, whether those units are teams individually and the members of the teams, or collections of teams. So there's a single product manager who is trying to define the functional need of the Agile release train, but not making assignments, not setting schedules, not driving the implementation of the teams. And the product owner, in the same way for a normal Agile team, is trying to facilitate the guidance of that Agile team. So we want to have extremely lightweight oversight, not heavyweight management. And again, the point of SAFE is if you need to scale, then you should apply these techniques. If you only have one or possibly two teams, I would not utilize Scaled Agile Framework. Once you get to, say, perhaps 3 teams, you should introduce it. So this is really more along the lines of understanding the planning units. So I hope I answered the concern. It's lighter weight. Now the question about the multiple demonstrations of delivery of value. At the end of every sprint, every team naturally delivers a demo. So we have the same challenge for that team. If that's one story didn't get delivered, they wouldn't demonstrate it. Now, if we scale to, say, 3 teams, and team A is being depended upon to deliver a story to team B, then that demo is at risk. So one of the ways of addressing that concern is to identify the dependencies at the PI or the program increment planning event. When we have coordinated planning, we would know that these 2 teams have a dependency on each other. So as we get to the end of every sprint, we want to make sure that those dependencies are known and whether or not we have to extend the delivery of that, not necessarily the release, but the delivery of that demo at the end. And then one last addition to that question, which may not have been directly implied. There is a system team that will be responsible for pulling multiple demos together from multiple teams. So it's not the burden of every team to do the system demo, but they provide the delivery to the demo. Now, I think your point is well made, and that is, how do we manage those dependencies? First, we manage them in the planning period, but second, we have, and I forgot to mention it, Scrum Master of Scrum Masters that coordinates across multiple teams. So I'm noticing that we're coming close, if not mere minutes away from the end, but one last question was over there, if I could. Is that appropriate? Thank you.
Okay, so my question is more on strategic themes or investment themes.
Yes.
So isn't it important for everyone in the organization to understand what are these, investment themes, and if so, well, how do you actually achieve that? Not hypothetically, but in practice.
Excellent question. So I'm going to flip back and forth between 2 and 3 levels, and they're both the same. So then I'll go back to the 3-level SAFE. I misspoke. I said 2. I meant 4. The strategic themes are the directions that the organization would like to go. Those strategic themes need to be realized and supported by the vision and the roadmap of an individual product manager for this Agile release train. So the direct answer to your question is it's the responsibility of the Agile release train to keep measuring themselves against the strategic themes. So this upward communication is, here is where we are, this is what we're satisfying against those strategic themes, and this portfolio community would be monitoring and reviewing the delivery of those things over time, but the responsibility is here at the Agile release train level to deliver against those themes. Any additional questions? I guess we're at the moment.
Yeah.
Thank you. One more time.
Just a question. If we have a really big system which have many software dependent on each other,
yes.
Shouldn't management team work also as Agile team? So we have several product managers, but they work together and can cover each other.
Yes, that's a very astute question, and it may not have been made as explicit, but notice here there's a label called the Kanban flow of the program level, and so the implication there is that this product management group is developing features, both defining them and prioritizing them and evolving them using Agile techniques. The same is true at the portfolio level. The discovery of the translation from strategic themes to desired epics would be using Agile techniques. So I think your point is really quite profound, and that is, if Agile is useful to the team, why isn't Agile useful to the product managers? Why isn't Agile useful to the portfolio managers? That's where the Kanban comes in. It's a good question. Thanks for that. And one last, I think I have 1 minute. Is that appropriate?
Actually, I have one question.
Okay, very good.
You already worked with in the new company Intermedics with new teams. So can you tell us what was like the most difficult part so far you experienced, like introducing SAFe, like in an environment where it never been used to?
Certainly. I'd actually like to switch from the specifics of Intermedics because we're actually in flight. But it's a meaningful question. But it was only last year in another environment, a very similar healthcare company. We went through a transformation which took us 2.5 years to go from not Agile to fully running the Scaled Agile framework. And some of the challenges were that, unfortunately, I'm pausing here trying to be nice about it, Agile coaches show up from different places at different times to different teams, and they give well-intentioned but often contradictory advice. And so local advice that is allowing an individual team to do something one way and a different team receives slightly different advice is the challenge that we have to address to provide consistent vocabulary, consistent practices, so that all teams are behaving similarly and that they do planning similarly, they do demos similarly, and they size stories similarly. We're not forcing everything to be identical, so that was one of the major challenges, was consistency across teams. The other challenge, to be honest, was on the product management side, that at the product owner level, we perhaps have too aggressively assumed that product owners have all decisions to be made about the priority and the parts of the backlog that's being implemented by an Agile team. So once you bring several product owners together, the arguments get a little intense at the product management level, and that was another serious challenge, was on the business side, trying to get them to the them. I hate that us and them reference because I prefer to have product management be thought of as part of the Agile environment, but having that community agree on the priorities. So in the prior life, one of the challenges of coming into this planning session was to agree on the top 10 features. We would ask each product owner what their top 10 features were. You would say one set of 10, someone else would say another set of 10, so we had 50 top 10 features. And so those were the two problems: consistency across teams and ability to have the product management agree on coordinated priorities. Any additional questions?
Maybe from the audience? No.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you, Daryl. It's one more thing left to do, so it's a small gift from Agile Lithuania, and thank you for coming
Thank you.
so far.
I appreciate it. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.